So we've already learned about all the causes of the Great Depression. What caused the stock market to crash? What caused that crash to snowball into a Great Depression? And we also learned about the lack of successful action taken by President Hoover. Now we need to talk about Roosevelt's New Deal and some of the things that FDR was doing to try to fix the problems of the Depression. In the election of 1932, Herbert Hoover was so unpopular that he loses his bid for re-election to FDR in an absolute landslide. You can see the electoral map here was grossly in favor of FDR over Hoover. Once in office, FDR appointed many advisors to help him enact the New Deal programs he wanted, and he refers to these people as his brain trust. His big goals were in 3 stages. Relief. He wanted direct aid to the poor and the unemployed. And this category is the biggest reason that Herbert Hoover was losing popularity with the American people, because he was not providing relief directly to the poor and unemployed. Recovery. This would help businesses get back on their feet. Herbert Hoover was trying some of these recovery efforts, but he wasn't doing enough, and FDR wanted to expand on what Hoover had already done and do even more. Reform. He wanted to change the economic system in a way that would correct the mistakes that had caused the Great Depression. These were also things that Herbert Hoover was not really doing. Herbert Hoover was so focused on recovery, and really not even doing enough there, that FDR hands down beats him in the 1932 presidential election with his New Deal platform. This is a photo of FDR. His first goal of relief. Within FDR's first 100 days in office, he and the Democratic majority in Congress took really bold measures to change the way things were going. And his very first goal, relief, is what he focused on first. First, a bank holiday. Banks were closed for a few days to give time for the Emergency Banking Act in 1933. And once this was passed, it would help the banks open securely, and this would hopefully improve the citizens' confidence in the banking system again. If you remember the scene that I showed you from It's a Wonderful Life, the holiday movie that's shown every year, there's a great scene in that movie where there's a run on the banks and people are removing all their monies from the banks. And the problem with that is that no bank ever actually holds cash on hand that totals the amount owed to the people owning shares in that bank. The Emergency Banking Act hoped to restore people's confidence in the banks after many people had lost all of their money in the collapse of the banking system following the stock market crash. The Public Works Administration. Although Herbert Hoover was doing a lot with public works, FDR massively expanded the efforts in public works. So federal spending on roads, bridges, libraries, hospitals, schools, courthouses, etc., it massively expanded, and it put tens of thousands of people back to work. Before I discuss anything else, I want to refer to this photo of Grimshaw Elementary School. This was built during the Great Depression, using funds from the Public Works Administration. Many projects just like this were used to put people back to work during the Great Depression. The Civilian Conservation Corps. Environmental projects like flood control, soil conservation, replanting of forests, public parks construction, all of these things put thousands more people back to work. So this was kind of a public works administration, but very specifically to do with environmental projects. Many of the campgrounds that you'll see around the state of New York that are run and operated by the Department of Environmental Conservation were created during the Great Depression using funds from the Civilian Conservation Corps. The Works Progress Administration. This helped put people back to work who were not receiving jobs in either the Public Works Administration or Civilian Conservation Corps. This dedicated money to paying the unemployed to do the simplest of work, maybe even raking leaves in a local park. FDR's second goal, recovery. The National Recovery Administration focused entirely on getting businesses back on their feet. However, to get funds, businesses had to agree to fair practices with their workers, such as a maximum number of hours worked, a minimum wage, and production quotas to control prices and prevent the kind of distorting of supply and demand that led to the low prices that put a lot of businesses out of business. Another piece of the National Recovery Administration was organized to give labor unions the ability to fight for better wages and/or benefits, and we'll come back to that in a moment. You can see an advertisement here from the Great Depression talking about how if you're going to go to work, make sure to join a union to fight for your workers' rights. Mortgage relief. The Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Administration both helped homeowners refinance their mortgages at fixed interest rates at even longer intervals to make the loans more affordable. This made it a lot more possible for lower class people to own a home rather than having to rent rundown apartments at much higher prices. The Agricultural Adjustment Act. This paid farmers money to take land out of production and or to destroy a portion of their crops or livestock to stabilize prices to levels that farmers and ranchers had enjoyed prior to and during World War I. Farm subsidies continue even today as a result of the Agricultural Adjustment Act. The movie Food, Inc. addresses the problems associated with modern farm subsidies. Really, the problem with modern farm subsidies is that corporate farms, the really big farms that tend to profit from farm subsidies way more than family-size farms. Some of those problems associated with that are farm foreclosures as well as unsafe mass-produced foods. We're seeing more and more of this in the media today. If you look at this graphic of a pig, 80% of farmers only get 17% of subsidy payments. The top 20% of farms get 83% of all of farm subsidy payments. The top 10% of that top 20%. So not the top 10%, the top 10% of the top 20% get 68% of farm subsidy payments. The top 5% of that top 10% of the top 20% gets 51%. And then the top 1% of the top 5% of the top 10% of the top 20%. I know that's long and confusing, but that means that this small little fraction of this entire graphic of a pig here gets 22% of farm subsidy payments. That's pretty obscene because farms that are that big don't really need any financial assistance. So it's one of the negatives that comes out of what was meant to be a very positive thing for farmers during the Great Depression. The third goal, reform. In the banking industry, the Glass-Steagall Act created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which is for short known as the FDIC today, to provide federally backed insurance to banks to ensure consumers that their money was safe in the bank. Today, people don't really need to worry that if for some reason there was a financial crisis, that the money they had in the bank was going to somehow disappear. In the stock market, the Securities and Exchange Commission, known today for short as the SEC, was set up in 1934, and this was to regulate pricing and trading practices in the stock market. The main goal is to prevent margin buying and speculation. And Social Security, something we kind of take for granted today that didn't exist until the Social Security Act of 1935. This provided insurance for the elderly, paid for by a combined tax on businesses and their employees. It also provided benefits to the unemployed. So today, when you contribute to Social Security throughout your working career, it's paid back to you in essentially a retirement benefit from the government. This was really meant to help the elderly get through the Depression and for the unemployed to get through the Depression. And many think that it was only meant to be temporary, but that it was so popular that it has stuck around even through today. The Tennessee Valley Authority. Farmers in this region are very desperately poor. This organization was given the authority to build dams to control flooding. This would kind of tie into the Civilian Conservation Corps. To build reservoirs near these dams to provide water, and to build power plants near the dams to provide power to the Tennessee Valley. The prices for TVA-generated electricity were very, very low and affordable to the average person. Labor unions. In the National Recovery Administration that I mentioned before, businesses were only given funds if they cooperated with labor unions to provide fair working hours, fair wages, etc. The Wagner Act of 1935 specifically laid out the workers' right to join a union, as well as for that union leadership to collectively bargain with their employers. What that means is that the employer and the leadership of a union sit down together to reach agreements on things like wages and working hours. The National Labor Relations Board was created to oversee such collective bargaining negotiations to make sure they're being done fairly. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 set minimum wage rates and maximum hours per week for workers in any industry engaged in interstate commerce. The law said that time and a half would be given for any overtime, and it also specifically closed out any more loopholes allowing for child labor. So there are now child labor laws protecting children from going to work. Many of these efforts are so popular that FDR is reelected in an even greater landslide than he won in 1932. Constitutional issues with the New Deal. The Supreme Court rejected certain things that Roosevelt had proposed through Congress, such as the National Recovery Administration and the Agricultural Adjustment Act. In 1935, the Supreme Court rules portions of the National Recovery Administration unconstitutional because it gave the executive branch legislative powers. So the Supreme Court is really trying to counteract that FDR had attempted to get legislation passed using tactics that bypassed Congress, who has legislative power. And the Supreme Court really came down hard on FDR trying to get legislation passed via his executive powers, which is unconstitutional. In 1936, the Supreme Court rules that the Agricultural Adjustment Act is unconstitutional because it was a direct government intervention in the free market economic system. This didn't really work because the legislature passed similar legislation that was not overturned only a couple years later in 1938. When FDR did not get cooperation from the Supreme Court, he proposed a court packing procedure that in 1937 would increase the number of justices on the Supreme Court from 9 to 15. Of course, the 6 justices that would be added to the court would be appointed by he himself. The plan is defeated in Congress as a very corrupt power grab by FDR. You can see in this cartoon where FDR had gotten Congress to agree with him, but that he was having a hard time getting the Supreme Court to fall in line with his proposals. FDR is elected to a 3rd term in 1940, and then a 4th term in the midst of World War II in 1944. It's very, very controversial because every president since George Washington had adhered to an unwritten rule of a 2-term limit established by George Washington when he refused a 3rd term as president back in 1796. The 22nd Amendment to the Constitution was passed in 1951, making it a constitutional law that a president was limited to 2 terms. Some opponents of the New Deal. Alfred Smith is a Democrat, and he's a supporter of FDR. He supports the New Deal early on, but as FDR starts to use some of his corrupt tactics, Alfred Smith turns against him and says that this is a big overstep of authority. Socialists. People like Norman Thomas, who was the Socialist Party candidate for president 3 different times. And he's saying that the liberal programs of FDR aren't enough, and that really it needs to be full-fledged socialism in order to get a classless society. This didn't gain much traction in American society. Populists like Huey Long promoted a Share Our Wealth program that would have forcibly taken money from the rich and given every American family an estate worth $5,000. This also didn't gain much traction among the American people. Father Coughlin, a Roman Catholic priest, had a national radio show in which he accuses FDR of being a socialist and accused Jews of controlling the banking industry and causing the Depression to begin with. He was so out there and a little crazy that the Catholic Church removes his show from the airwaves as a result of these accusations. Dr. Townsend. Francis Townsend criticized FDR for not doing enough to help the elderly and the unemployed and was pushing for what eventually becomes the Social Security Administration. He calls for a payment of $200 to every unemployed citizen over the age of 60 to help people and to stimulate the economy. He kind of comes around and supports FDR once the Social Security Administration is proposed, but he was a strong opponent of FDR until he agreed to do so. Supporters of the New Deal. Liberals supported the New Deal as a program that saved democracy and the free market system. FDR became more and more popular, particularly through his fireside chats over the radio in which he speaks directly to the American people. Really, no president before him was able to do so. The radio really provided him with a new avenue of speaking directly to the American people. This could really be compared today to the ability for politicians to use social media to communicate with the people today. FDR's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, was actively involved in the New Deal with her husband and was thought to represent the new woman that was actively involved in society. First ladies prior to Eleanor Roosevelt had really just been for show. Eleanor Roosevelt was changing that view. She was showing that a first lady could be actively involved in what's going on in the country. FDR had the first woman cabinet member and also had multiple African American members of the cabinet. So he's really a lot more diverse than previous presidents in who he puts in his presidential cabinet. When Marian Anderson, a popular opera singer, is denied the right to sing in an opera hall in Washington, D.C., FDR, and especially his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, made sure that Anderson could still sing and would be broadcasted nationally. You see that they chose to put her in front of the Lincoln Memorial because her whole denial to the opera hall was because of the fact that she was black. And they wanted the symbolism of how racist that was to really show by putting her in front of the Lincoln Memorial to sing her opera music outdoors to a crowd of thousands and to a home listening crowd of millions. Some of the literature, music, and movies and comics of the 1930s were mostly meant to lift people's spirits. Now, there were some depressing literature pieces, such as The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, which we already mentioned in our previous presentation. It's about the Dust Bowl. William Faulkner wrote some pretty depressing stuff during the Depression. But most things are an attempt to lift people's spirits. The big band music of Glenn Miller and Benny Goodman, for example, is meant to lift people's spirits. Family-friendly movies like The Wizard of Oz that are inexpensive to go see. These are meant to lift people's spirits. And comic books for kids that were available for very, very low prices, really meant to keep the spirits of the people up during the Depression. This is the end of the presentation. Please make sure that you go back and take the online quiz associated with the presentation. Use your notes. If you use your notes, there's really no reason that you can't get a perfect score. Thank you. See you in class.